If you're like me, you probably wake up every morning with a vague sense of having just had a really interesting dream. A feeling that there was something important you were supposed to remember. But when you try to grab hold of it, it slips through your fingers, and all you're left with is a jumble of disconnected images and feelings. So what the heck is going on? Why can't we remember our dreams? Well, for a long time, scientists didn't know. It wasn't until 2021 that researchers finally published a study identifying two very specific brain regions that are responsible for that morning after dream. And they even had a hypothesis about why these regions do what they do. Their work was published in the journal Neuron. The first thing you should know about memory is that the brain doesn't actually make memories. The brain is more like a library that stores memories. Different parts of the brain are responsible for storing different types of memories. For example, the hippocampus is important for putting new declarative memories into the library. Declarative memories are things you might share with someone else, like what you did last weekend or what you ate for breakfast, but other memories are stored in different parts of the brain. Procedural memories, which include things like how to ride a bike, are stored in the cerebellum and the basoganglia. And emotional memories are stored in the amygdala. Dreams themselves are also stored in the brain, but not in any of those places. When researchers were studying this, they found that dreams are stored in the entorhinal cortex and the perineal cortex. These two areas are sort of the last stop before the brain sends them to be stored more permanently. They're like the Dewey Decimal System of the brain. But the question still remained, why don't we remember them? To figure out why we can't remember our dreams, researchers decided to study mice. Because mice have been shown to have similar kinds of dreams to humans. They used a very clever method to identify what brain activity in sleeping mice looked like when they were dreaming. Basically, they trained the mice to press a lever when they wanted some tasty cheese. Then the researchers monitored their brain activity as they slept and recorded the times when the mice pressed the lever in their dreams. They identified brain activity associated with lever pressing, and then they looked at the activity of individual neurons. They found two groups of neurons in the entorhinal cortex and perineal cortex that became active when the mouse was both awake and pressing the lever, but that shut off during sleep. And they discovered that this same pattern of activity also occurred when the mouse was dreaming. In other words, these neurons seemed to encode the memory of lever pressing. But there was one big difference between the brain activity of the awake mouse and the sleeping mouse. During sleep, another group of neurons in the prefrontal cortex started to activate. This group of neurons was sending signals to the neurons that were actively remembering the lever pressing, effectively turning down their activity. In other words, the part of the brain that makes memories was turning down the volume on the part of the brain that was remembering. So the researchers hypothesized that this process could be happening in humans too, and that the reason we can't remember our dreams is that our brain is actively trying to stop us from remembering them. And it makes sense that our brains would want to do this. Scientists think that the purpose of dreams is to process emotions and store them alongside memories of related events. In other words, dreams take memories that are already in the brain and add an emotional tag to them so we remember them better. If we didn't have this extra emotional processing, we wouldn't remember emotionally charged events as well. But if you think about it from the brain's point of view, it makes sense that it would want to keep its emotional processing separate from our waking lives. After all, the brain doesn't get to take breaks like we do, so it tries to get us to forget our dreams by actively suppressing the brain regions that encode them. And that suppression happens right after we wake up. So next time you wake up and can't remember your dreams, take comfort in knowing that your brain is working hard to protect itself. And if you want to remember your dreams, try writing them down as soon as you wake up. That may help bypass the brain's efforts to forget. Speaking of things that are hard to remember, can you remember where you learned about the human reproductive system? Probably not unless you took a course on it recently.